So thank you, Per, and pleased to have this opportunity just to share some of my research interests with you. So uncertainty. My research explores how uncertainty influences simultaneously financial markets and the macroeconomy. I address this challenge from the perspective of a model builder who used statistical methods. And these methods are used to understand both the strengths and weaknesses of the models under consideration. Now, today's talk is going to take a little bit of inspiration from someone that I only recently learned Alfred Nobel found influential, but Voltaire. So there's this quote from Voltaire that's, my French isn't great, but kind of doubt is not is not a very agreeable condition, but certainty is absurd. So why do I find that interesting? So I'm going to draw on a distinction here for some of my talk, for the latter part of my talk. It's a distinction that was really pioneered by a University of Chicago economist, Frank Knight. And it's a distinction between risk, where for me, risk are the probabilities assigned by a given model, and so-called ambiguity. So I'm going to call ambiguity not knowing which among a family of models should be used to assess risk. The skepticism that I mentioned from Voltaire is going to be skepticism about the model specification, uncertainty about the model specification. So I want to extend this. I want to think of about a broad notion of uncertainty that goes beyond kind of more narrowly defined notions of risk. So throughout my talk, I'm going to try to draw an important distinction and vantage points. I'm going to think about researchers outside a model, and this is the more usual kind of statistician or kind of applied researcher perspective. Suppose I take a model. I take a dynamic economic model. With that model, a statistician can kind of estimate parameters and can also assess the model implications. Then I'm going to go and also talk about investors inside the model. So when you build a dynamic model, part of what you have to do is you've got to depict the economic agents, the consumers, investors, entrepreneurs, policymakers alike, and they cope with uncertainty, and one has to take a stand on that. And then we're interested in constructing the equilibrium interactions that acknowledge this uncertainty. So the rest of my talk, I'm going to try to sketch out a little bit of a perspective, historical perspective on time series econometrics and in particular rational expectations. I'm going to talk about some of my initial contributions to econometrics, the field that links economics and statistics, and then I'm going to talk about some applications and extensions. I'm going to summarize briefly what I see as the empirical challenge coming out of that, and then I want to revisit this more generalized concept of uncertainty. And I'm going to first explore how about from the vantage point of the investors inside the model. But then I also want to discuss it, I want to make some conjectures about uncertainty as it pertains to policy. So let me kind of dig way back here. There's if we look at the origins of the kind of modeling component to finance, one can trace this back to Bachelet. Now, Bachelet was one of the initiators of the use of Brownian motion. Now, his work wasn't really discovered by economists until like 50 years later, but the idea here was there's, financial markets, part of what they have to do is they have to figure out how to a response to kind of shocks that impinge on the underlying economy. Now, relatedly, although these literatures did not communicate, Slutsky from Russia, as well as Yule, who is an eminent time series statistician, were building these models where they're trying to think about random shocks as impulses for time series that were themselves correlated. So the idea is how can we take these random shocks as building blocks and produce interesting dynamic patterns in economic time series? Now, why the connection between macroeconomics and finance? Well, macroeconomic shocks, by their very natures, are things which you can't diversify, you can't average out. Those are the ones which investors, when they're exposed to, require compensation. So I find there a very natural link between macro and finance for this reason. Now, one of the initial Nobel laureates, one of the two initial Nobel laureates in economics was Ragnar Frisch. And Frisch was building. Part of what he was doing was he was taking these Slutsky-Ewell insights, but he was actually building formal economic models with economic inputs. And subsequently, Habermas pushed this a little bit further in the sense of how can we frame this in ways in which you can do formal statistical analysis. Now, the perspective of Habermas was statistical analysis from, say, outside the model. An econometrician's given a model. What does an econometrician or statistician do with it? Okay? But inside these models are investors, and these investors, are making decisions that depend on guesses of the future. And what this initial literature did was it kind of imposed convenient expectational mechanisms, so-called adaptive expectations, or appealed to empirical evidence on beliefs. And so there was interesting things going on inside the model, but the problem with this more limited view or this approach to expectations was it wasn't very useful as a policy tool. And here's why. So one of the reasons I'm interested and econometricians in general are interested in building models is that we want to use these models to do so-called counterfactuals, to do policy analyses that change the economic environment and see what happens. Okay? So once you start doing those experiments, you can't just hold fixed the beliefs of the investors inside the model, or else you can get nonsensical calculations out of it. And so Muth and Lucas took this very elegant simplification. They kind of said, well, let's use the model and presume that economic agents inside the model kind of figure things out in the so-called rational expectations approach. And so they endowed the people inside the model with a fairly high degree of sophistication when it comes to making beliefs. And then when you change the model ingredients, you had a very sharp prediction on what would happen to the beliefs of the economic agents. It kind of pulled off the table this notion of designing economic policies that systematically fooled people. So I find this to be a very powerful insight and a very useful, demonstrably useful one. Now, it also posed some interesting challenges for econometrics. So here the expectations are determined inside the model. This gave rise to a new form of econometric restrictions, so-called cross-equation restrictions, but it also imposed a challenge. It requires a complete specification, including a specification of the information available to economic agents inside the model. And I think of this kind of formal approach as initiated by one of my longtime co-authors and mentors, Tom Sargent, but also my initial paper was very much in the same lines as an economist. I'm a bit younger than Gene. So it was problematic to actually have this approach that really required that you had to do everything. So basically, to study this linkage between finance and macroeconomics, what you had to do is you had to build a model that was fully rich on the macroeconomic side and integrated formally the financial market structure in it. And especially for a wide variety of initial applications, this was really too much to ask. So I worked on this method, which doesn't have a very catchy title, I might say, generalized method of moments estimation. But what this was about is studying what is called partially specified models. It allows people, myself and others, to study this linkage between financial markets and the macroeconomy without having a fully specified model of both and a fully integrated model of both. This work was able to build on and extend an earlier econometrics literature, which was estimating single equations and simultaneous equation systems. So this idea of doing something without doing everything was certainly very much within the econometrics literature, and I give a key citation for which my work builds from Sargan. What I was able to do was to extend and enrich in the underlying environment to have a much richer time series and dynamic structure, and to make it then therefore relevant to study these so-called rational expectations models. So let me just sketch out how the basic idea works. Okay, so I'll bore you with a little bit of math here. Hopefully not bore you, but maybe intrigue you. I don't know. But anyway, a key input into any dynamic model is some type of investment equation. It's going to be an investment equation: physical capital, human capital, financial assets, or the like. So in terms of this equation, think of this vector xt plus L as maybe some payoff and some investment that's going to occur down the road at time period t plus L. Okay. I'm going to look at its valuation from the standpoint of time period t. That's captured by this information set ft. But then I have to assign prices to this, or I have to assign valuations to this. And here I'm going to use a construct that's turned out to be demonstrably useful in building, building and testing models of financial markets called a stochastic discount factor. Okay. So a stochastic discount factor here, if I use the ratio between date t plus L and date t, that's going to do the following. It's going to represent how markets discount the future, but it's also going to make risk adjustments. And the reason it's stochastic is in order to allow for there to be compensations for any exposures to aggregate economic risk. And so now I form this expectation. Say, think of this as a rational expectations expectation, if you like. And then once I form that expectation, then I get the vector of prices QT. So this is like a very standard valuation problem. And lots of economics gets loaded into this stochastic discount factor specification. It can depend on investors' risk preferences, how they discount the future. It can depend on market structure and the like. And there's been a whole array of applications kind of mapping into this type of framework. Now, the expectation used here, instead of the one determined by a full model, I've not written down a full model here. This is only a piece of a model. And this equation by itself doesn't determine the entire macroeconomy at all, or the full dynamic economic system. It's just a piece of it. So the expectation here, instead of using the model, I'm just going to use the data generating process and the notions that investors inside the model kind of have figured that out, consistent with the rational expectations hypothesis. So how do you make this operational? Well, what I said is one of the challenges is the fact that we specifying the full information set of the investors FT. Okay, so I've just rewritten that basic valuation equation here. And now just trust me, I know how to do matrix multiplication right, that there's a ZT of variables and investor information sets. I'm just going to do the appropriate multiplication. It's all, and then I'm just going to average out over the conditioning information set. So at this point in time, I no longer have to tell you exactly what FT is. I just have to produce a set of variables that are inside the investor information set. So the stochastic discount factor in these representations will often depend on data, which an econometrician can observe, but also model parameters. I can imagine approximating this by some time series average. I can build, and then from that you can build and justify formal methods for estimation and inference. And the key thing here is by proceeding this way, we avoid this complete specification of investor information. And these same methods can be extended, although I won't develop it here, to estimate and assess models that are misspecified. Of course, we know not all models are misspecified. That's the whole very nature of their model. And sometimes it's handy for a researcher to take a priori stands on what the model is good for and perhaps not. So what I described sounds very, very simple. It turns out there are some subtleties that go along with it. There's a whole bunch of ways to do the construction which I just described. There's a whole family of estimators that go with it. And it's then possible to take this problem and connect it to a very rich literature in theoretical statistics called semiparametric estimation. So there's a parameter of interest here that feeds through the stochastic discount factor. But then there's also in the background some fully rich specification of a dynamic model, which is the thing which we're trying to avoid completely. So implicitly, that's treated non-parametrically. And then what you can do is you can kind of build in this apparatus and construct a whole well-defined notion of efficiency bounds for now a whole class of mini estimators. And I did this in subsequent work, as did Gary Chamberlain in complementary work. Now, this perspective I've described so far, it's useful to have, it kind of led me and some others to think about alternative ways to go here. For reasons I'll motivate in just a few minutes, sometimes it's very handy to ignore this kind of parametric structure of a so-called stochastic discount factor. To say, let's just even start more primitively. Let's suppose we know nothing about the stochastic discount factor, and let's go to the asset market data and figure out what we can learn about these stochastic discount factors. And so full characterizations of this I did in work with Jagannathan and a former student of mine, Letmer. Now, as I said, all models are misspecified. The perspective that the inferential methods that I described so far kind of presume that the model was correctly specified. So this led me to kind of think, well, how might we proceed differently if we just put on the table right at the outset that the model is misspecified? And this is important when we do comparison across models, across potentially misspecified models. It leads to a rather different perspective on both model comparison and on estimation. And this I also did with work with a variety of collaborators. I think I just went the wrong way. I put this upside down. Let me try this. Okay, so applications to empirical finance. Here, early on in my career, I kind of started my career out at Carnegie Mellon and subsequently went to Chicago. I had many important collaborators in which we pushed lots of empirical investigations in a variety of directions. And so here's some pictures of some of my early collaborators. I'm just going to talk about two of these contributions for the purposes of today's talk. Ken Singleton and I took the methods I just described and really studied formally these macro finance linkages. We took a so-called stochastic discount factor model, but one that macroeconomists of the day was kind of very typical inside their models. It was a very commonly used one. And others had speculated that this model might be problematic when it came to financial market linkages. We were able to use formal statistical methods and to characterize the limitations of this model as it confronted the rich array of financial market data. There's just too much, the type of heterogeneity, some of which Gene has described, that's really displayed in empirical evidence here, could not be tracked by this model. And what this led to was a variety of subsequent researchers exploring different investor preferences, different models of investor preferences. It also allowed to have people explore different markets, different structures of financial markets and the like. So it helped to set up a rather rich subsequent empirical literature, thinking about how to construct better models of stochastic discount factors. Now, as indicated before, I also found it useful to do this research that said, let's suppose we just go to the financial market data and see what it tells us about stochastic discount factors. Okay. And so we were able to produce some usable empirical characterizations with both Jaganathan and subsequently with Cochrane about characterizing with usable empirical characterizations that I argue have been empirically revealing. So let me give a not completely fair but somewhat superficial summary of key findings out of this, but ones that I think will serve this talk just fine. So let's think about the so-called, what I call the changing price of uncertainty. Okay, so recall these stochastic discount factors encode compensations for exposures to risk, so-called risk prices out of the finance literature. Now, once I understand better how stochastic discount factors, should be working in terms of pricing things, I'm learning that provides me. I'm learning things about these so-called risk prices. And kind of a basic finding is that this risk price channel provides a predictable and important source for variation observed in security markets. The earlier work showed that these stochastic discount factors were highly variable. This volatility or this variability was conditioned on information pertinent to investors. It wasn't just there because of investors observed more. Moreover, that a key insight developed subsequently by Campbell and Cochrane is that volatility is seemingly higher in bad macroeconomic times than good ones. So this opens the door to a modeling challenge. What's the source of this stochastic discount factor volatility? And I'm going to speculate on it in what follows. This is a possible explanation. So others have speculated on different ones. What about investors concerned about misspecification, but now inside a dynamic economic model? So I spent the first part of my career rejecting a bunch of simple models. And kind of evolved to this notion that, that even more generally, models are misspecified. And maybe what we ought to be thinking instead is about how to use misspecified models in seemingly sophisticated ways. So before I kind of develop that more fully, it's useful to take a bit of an excursion under which, suppose I just imagine that I've got investors in the market and they got the wrong expectations. I call this a belief distortion. Okay? And And this belief distortion, then, I'm going to introduce this, in the top equation there, I introduce this E tilde. That's because it's some type of a distorted expectation relevant to investors. Now, there's a stochastic discount factor that goes along with it. Under that distorted expectation, that's the one that's assigning the appropriate risk prices. So I'm going to call that this S tilde T plus L over S tilde T is the corresponding stochastic discount factor that can depend, say, on observable variables and unknown parameters. Then the rest is the equation as I've written before. The xt plus L are the payoffs in the future, and the qt is the price today, and the ft is the current period information set. Now, at the end of the day, I'm a model builder, so I can't just like write down some E tilde and say that I'm done. So it's convenient to take these distorted beliefs and actually represent them in a mathematically convenient way. And it's known from the applied probability literature how to do this. It's in these dynamic contexts, martingales, positive martingales can serve this purpose. And so the middle line here just uses that mathematical trick of martingales to represent what the E tilde is. It's what I do is I scale variables by this martingale, and then that allows me to represent the distorted beliefs. So now I can go back and use that and see how this connects back to the earlier formula which I had for stochastic discount factors related to asset prices. And so I've just rewritten the top equation in the very in the third equation here, and you can see that it's what I picked up here is it's the counterpart to the stochastic discount factor that we're talking about before has two terms in it that get multiplied together: a martingale component and a stochastic discount factor that's making the adjustments for risk given the whatever expectations are the relevant ones for the investor. So I'm going to that product formula is going to be very useful in framing my subsequent discussion. Okay, so I've just rewritten this. So we think about this M as capturing so-called distorted beliefs, and the S tilde as risk preferences. It could also be capturing aspects of market structure. Imagine we can construct S tilde from data and model parameters. Now this M, these distorted beliefs, also have a connection to statistics. If I look at what's called a likelihood ratio between the distorted model and the original model, the correctly specified one, that's what this M is. When this M is 1, then there's no distortion. And when M is close to 1, the distortion is small. Statistical criterion, therefore, can be used to imply interpretable measures of the magnitude of this distortion. So what's the idea here? Well, we're kind of want to extend this notion of rational expectations in a way that's in interesting directions. When this distortion is small, a statistician, even with a large number of historical observations, will struggle to tell the difference between the two models. So one can think about the rational expectations paradigm as just giving these investors an infinite histories. And now this opens the door to thinking about, well, when are finite histories informative for some models and when they're not? So again, I've just rewritten the top equation: distorted beliefs, risk preferences. As I indicated, there's these statistical tools that support a refinement of rational expectations, allow us to kind of push this M away from 1, but in ways under which the idea is that if there's a lot of historical evidence that ought to be revealing lots about the model, then those are things maybe investors have figured out. Other stuff, maybe there's scope for distortions. So the inspiration behind this is that I want to detect when historical evidence is less informative. And I want to put some discipline on this scope of belief distortions. So there's lots of belief distortions that have shown up in the economics literature, going back to Keynes. Animal spirits are models that have trade, typically rely on heterogeneous beliefs. There's lots of speculations about the role of subjective concerns about events that occur very, very infrequently. And there's discussions of, say, the terms overconfidence. Okay? My argument here is that I expect these type of distortions to be more prevalent in cases in which historical evidence is weaker relative when it's far more revealing. So now the modeling challenge is I don't want to put everything in just some arbitrarily specified distorted belief, because that can get too much mileage out of that. Right? So I want to add some structure and content to the belief distortion, get precise ways to produce models of these belief distortions. And remember this insight from stochastic discount factors that empirical work is the fact that the belief distortions, we want these belief distortions to be a substitute for these fluctuating risk prices. And we want them to imitate this notion that these seemingly risk prices, I'm now going to think of these as uncertainty prices, are bigger in, get larger in bad macroeconomic times than good ones. Okay. So the approach now is I'm going to turn back to this model misspecification and a more generalized notion of uncertainty, not one that's just tied explicitly to risk. Okay. So let me just remind us what our discussions of risk were, and they add a little bit more formalism to it. So think about risk. I've got to, suppose there's an outcome for next period, or call it Y. There's a current period state X, and it may depend on some parameter theta. And I can represent this, say, as a probability density. And the theta here is just some generic entity that indexes a whole family of models. And this could be a very, very large family of potential models on the table. Now, when I think about ambiguity, as I say, this kind of risk ambiguity distinction was pioneered by Knight. When I think about ambiguity, I'm going to think about there being a potential family of distributions that I'm going to put over the parameter theta. And they could be very degenerate ones, or they could have a fairly rich structure to them. Now there's some beautiful work that came out of Bayesian statistics. It was kind of initiated by Di, and it was kind of provided full axiomatic treatment by Savage about how with enough structure, I can address this in a really simple and straightforward way. I come up with a unique pi, and then I just take and I average across the different models using that pi probability distribution. But if you go back and even read Di and Savage, they themselves thought this was a nice, elegant result, but that in practice there was non-trivial issues about the specification of what this pi might be, and that sensitivity analyses would be in order. So I want to think about there being potentially a family of these probability distributions. And what I want to do is imagine, I'm going to imagine saying, well, I don't know which pi to use. Part of what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the utility consequences of it. I'm going to, which pi's matter to the decision maker because they have adverse consequences and which ones don't. And I'm going to kind of lead to distortions for the ones that have the largest utility consequences. And so this is going to be implemented as a distorted model average. So this is going to give me, as implementation, some counterpart to that M, but it's going to come from a much, it's going to come from the struggle about not knowing how to weight alternative models on the table, and to putting some type of, but still putting some type of limits on that exploration. Okay, and this type of approach that I'm talking about was really kind of pioneered by Wald a long time ago. Now, I'm able to build on ideas out of, in order to proceed along this, and I've been doing this with my collaborator, Sargent, we could build on work from control theory, under which produces convenient ways to parameterize or represent rich classes of models. We can build on analyses coming out of Bayesian decision theory, where we think about robust counterparts. We think about, well, I don't know which prior to be using, and I want to do some type of prior sensitivity analysis. What's available, as I say, at the end of the day, I'm a model builder. What's available is some extensions of Savage axiomatic treatments in order to justify such approaches, as well as tractable representations, which is really key for my own research. So what can we get out of this? I'm not going to get into mechanical details, but let me just try to describe what you can hope to get out of this. So one can imagine a couple different skepticisms about models. So I can imagine some model in the future is going to change from the model we have, which seems relevant today, in ways that I can't really connect to historical data. So I might want to be concerned about those type of sources of changes in models. But on the other hand, there'll be other features of models that potentially can be learned based on past information. But even in those cases, there will remain some notion of prior ambiguity. So kind of what we can hope to get out of this, so what you can find in terms of doing calculations like this, and we've done this in a variety of different settings, is that consider this, suppose you introduce uncertainty to investors that has some form of persistence in the growth rate. So there's some type of uncertainty about macroeconomic growth. So we're in some type of recession, and we don't really know how persistent the consequences of this recession are going to be. And now start asking yourself, suppose there's high persistence. High persistence is going to be bad in bad times because things are bad, and if things are highly persistent, they're going to remain bad, so that would be bad news. How about in good times? Well, good times you would love things to be, growth rates to be highly persistent, but in fact, so what you're really concerned about is low persistence. And this changing perspective of kind of what aspects of model specification which you might want to be concerned about, or be skeptical about, that becomes an interesting way to have these uncertainty prices to reflect, to fluctuate over time in ways that are interesting. So what this produces is an explicit model of these distorted beliefs that now has a much more primitive origins to it with concrete predictions. These are things which are computed out now in terms of the model itself and observable data. So let me just speculate for the last, very briefly, about uncertainty and policy implications. So for policy implications, there's kind of two approaches. One that's been developed extensively by and applied in various different guises. And this is I think, of uncertainty outside of a model. We take a structural econometric model. We can go to a policymaker and we can say, well, here's the amount of uncertainty about parameters or uncertainty about various different models. This has been done, it's been done increasingly recently in models of, say, relevant for monetary policy analysis. I think in general it hasn't been done enough, but there's certainly been advances of that. But inside those models, investors typically have everything figured out. I think the more exciting challenge is this idea of equilibrium interactions within a model in which policymakers and the private sector simultaneously confront uncertainty. And in these type of scenarios, this kind of opens a new way for kind of very interesting interactions and some subtle impacts of uncertainty going forward. I will dispense with my speculations about financial oversight and uncertainty, which I think is which is a truly fascinating topic that I've thought about. But let me conclude. I look forward to learning from younger scholars who take up this exciting challenge of building even better models that link macroeconomics and financial markets in ways that cope with and confront uncertainty. Thank you.